The morning started badly for Grace Lynn. Her alarm didn't go off, which meant she woke up 40 minutes late. She threw on the only decent clothes she owned, a navy blazer and matching skirt that she'd bought from the Goodwill store 3 years ago. The fabric was a bit worn at the elbows, but it was clean and pressed. She grabbed a granola bar, kissed her sleeping mother on the forehead, and rushed out the door. The parking ticket sat on her kitchen counter, mocking her. $85. It might as well have been $800. She'd gotten it 2 months ago while rushing Mrs. Kowalski, her elderly neighbor, to the emergency room. The woman had been having chest pains, and Grace didn't think twice. She'd parked in a loading zone, helped Mrs. Kowalski inside, and stayed with her for 6 hours until her daughter arrived from out of state. When she finally got back to her car, the ticket was tucked under her windshield wiper. Grace had tried to contest it by mail, explaining the situation, but received a form letter back. Insufficient documentation, it said. The fine had now grown to $120 with late fees. If she didn't show up today, it would double again. So here she was, taking a morning off from work she couldn't afford to miss, to stand in front of a judge and explain herself. The courthouse downtown was an imposing building, all granite and tall columns. Grace climbed the steps slowly, clutching the envelope with her documentation. Inside, the marble floors echoed with footsteps and voices. Lawyers in sharp suits strode past her, their shoes clicking confidently. They carried leather briefcases and spoke into cell phones, their voices full of authority. Grace felt small. She always felt small in places like this. She found the clerk's window after wandering the hallways for 10 minutes. A woman sat behind bulletproof glass, typing on her computer. Grace cleared her throat. "Excuse me?" The woman didn't look up. "Excuse me, I need to know where to go for traffic court." The woman sighed heavily, as if Grace had just asked her to solve world hunger. She finally looked up, her eyes scanning Grace from head to toe. The look said everything. It said, "You don't belong here. 3rd floor. Room 312, you have your ticket number?" Grace fumbled with her envelope. "Yes, it's right here. Don't show me." "Show the judge." The woman turned back to her computer. Next. But there was no one behind Grace. The woman just wanted her gone. Grace found the elevator and rode up to the 3rd floor. Her hands were sweating. She'd never been to court before, never even had a speeding ticket. She was the kind of person who followed rules, who stayed quiet, who tried not to make waves. Room 312 was packed. People sat on wooden benches that reminded Grace of church pews. Some looked nervous like her. Others looked angry. A few looked resigned, like they'd been through this dance before. She found a spot near the back and sat down, clutching her envelope. A bailiff stood near the judge's bench, calling out names. One by one, people approached. Grace watched, trying to learn the procedure. Some cases lasted 2 minutes. Others went longer. The judge, a gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, seemed irritated by everything. He kept checking his watch. Lynn, Grace Lynn. Her heart jumped. She stood up so fast she nearly dropped her papers. Walking to the front of the courtroom felt like walking through water. Every eye seemed to be on her. She could hear whispers. Or maybe she was imagining them. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You're contesting a parking violation. Loading zone. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor, I can explain." "I've heard every explanation there is, Miss Lynn. I've heard about dying grandmothers, sick children, alien abductions." A few people in the courtroom chuckled. "What makes yours special?" Grace felt her face grow hot. "My neighbor was having chest pains. I drove her to the hospital. I parked in the loading zone because I needed to help her inside. She's 83 years old and—" "Do you have documentation from the hospital?" "I have her discharge papers. They show the date and time." Grace held up the papers with shaking hands. The judge waved dismissively. "Those don't prove you parked illegally. They prove your neighbor was at the hospital. For all I know, you dropped her off and parked there to go shopping." "I didn't go shopping. I stayed with her for 6 hours. Miss Lynn." The judge's voice was sharp. "I don't have time for long stories. You parked illegally. You got a ticket. That's how this works. Do you have the money to pay?" Grace felt tears prickling at her eyes. She blinked them back hard. She would not cry, not here. Not in front of all these people. "Your Honor, I take care of my mother. She has Parkinson's. I work full-time at a legal aid office. The fine with late fees is now $120. I can pay it, but it means we won't make rent this month. Everyone has problems, Miss Lynn. The judge leaned back in his chair. The law is the law. You can't park in a loading zone just because you have a sob story. Pay the fine or face additional penalties. Next case. Grace stood there for a moment, frozen. That was it? She drove across town, took time off work, brought documentation, and that was it? Miss Lynn, you're dismissed. Next case. She walked back through the courtroom in a daze. Behind her, she heard voices. These people always have some excuse, a young man in an expensive suit whispered to his colleague. His voice wasn't as quiet as he thought. Never want to take responsibility. Personal responsibility is dead, his colleague agreed. Grace kept walking. Her face burned. Her hands shook. When she reached the hallway, she leaned against the wall and took deep breaths. Don't cry. Don't give them the satisfaction. She went back to the clerk's window and paid the fine. $120. She watched the number appear on the receipt and felt something break inside her. Not her spirit exactly. Something else. Some small belief she'd held that the system was fair, that if you explained yourself, people would listen. The same clerk who'd been rude earlier processed her payment without a word. Grace wondered if she even remembered her from an hour ago. Probably not. She was nobody. Just another face in an endless line of faces. She walked back through the marble hallways, past the confident lawyers, past the important people doing important things. She pushed through the heavy doors and stood at the top of the courthouse steps, squinting in the bright sunlight. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out, expecting a text from work asking where she was. Instead, it was a number she'd been waiting 3 years to see. Her hands started shaking again, but this time for a different reason entirely. Grace stood on those courthouse steps, clutching her phone, and started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when the universe reveals its sense of irony. She looked back at the courthouse, at those imposing columns and granite walls, and thought about the judge who'd dismissed her, the clerk who'd treated her like dirt, and the lawyers who'd mocked her in whispers they thought she couldn't hear. None of them knew. None of them had any idea, and honestly, that made it so much better. Grace walked to her car, the phone still buzzing with messages, and allowed herself a smile. A real one this time, because in 2 weeks she'd be walking back through those courthouse doors, but next time everything would be different. Grace sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at her phone screen. The email had come through while she was inside being humiliated. The subject line read, "Congratulations, judicial appointment confirmed." She read it 3 times to make sure it was real. "Dear Grace Lynn, we are pleased to inform you that your appointment as Circuit Court Judge has been confirmed by the State Judiciary Committee. Your swearing-in ceremony is scheduled for 2 weeks from today at 10 o'clock in the morning. Please contact our office to confirm your attendance and discuss the ceremony details." Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. 3 years. 3 long years of interviews, background checks, peer reviews, and evaluations. 3 years of keeping quiet about the process because she didn't want to jinx it, didn't want to deal with people's questions or expectations or doubts. And now it was real. She was going to be a judge. At the same courthouse where she'd just been treated like garbage, the irony wasn't lost on her. Grace started the car but didn't drive away yet. She thought about the path that had brought her here. It hadn't been easy. Nothing in her life had been easy. She grew up in a small apartment above a dry cleaner, the daughter of immigrants who worked 16-hour days to make ends meet. Her parents had big dreams for her. Education was everything. In America, her father always said, knowledge is the only thing nobody can take from you. So Grace studied. While other kids played after school, she was at the library. While they went to parties in high school, she was preparing for college entrance exams. She got a full scholarship to State University and worked nights at a diner to pay for everything the scholarship didn't cover. Law school was harder. No scholarship this time. She took out loans, massive loans that still kept her up at night. She worked as a waitress, a tutor, whatever she could find. She studied in the breaks between shifts, reading case law while other servers smoked cigarettes out back. Her mother got sick during her 2nd year, Parkinson's disease. Grace became her primary caregiver while juggling school and work. There were nights she fell asleep with law books on her chest, her alarm set for 3 hours later so she could help her mother to the bathroom. She graduated 3rd in her class, not first. She always wondered if she would have been first if she'd had fewer responsibilities, more time to study. But that kind of thinking didn't help anyone. After law school, she could have joined a big firm. Her grades were good enough. Several had made offers. But Grace had seen too much poverty, too much struggle. She'd spent her whole life watching people get chewed up by systems they didn't understand. So she joined legal aid instead. The pay was terrible. Her law school friends made 3 times her salary, drove nice cars, lived in nice apartments. Grace lived with her mother in their small house, drove a car held together by prayers and duct tape, and represented clients who couldn't afford anyone else. She defended single mothers facing eviction. She fought for disability benefits for injured workers. She represented immigrants navigating a legal system designed to confuse them. She won cases everyone said were unwinnable because she worked harder than anyone else, stayed later, dug deeper. 10 years. 10 years of fighting for people the system had forgotten. And then one day, Judge Patricia Okonkwo called her into chambers after a hearing. Grace thought she was in trouble for something. Instead, the judge closed the door and asked her a question. "Have you ever thought about becoming a judge?" Grace had laughed. "Me? No, I'm just a legal aid attorney." "Just?" Judge Okonkwo raised an eyebrow. "Grace, I've watched you in my courtroom for 5 years. You're one of the best attorneys I've seen. You understand the law, but more importantly, you understand people. You understand what justice actually means." "I don't have the connections," Grace said. "I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I don't know the right people." "The judiciary needs people like you," Judge Okonkwo said. "People who remember what it's like to struggle. People who see the humans behind the case numbers. Will you at least think about applying?" That conversation had been 3 years ago. Judge Okonkwo became her mentor, guiding her through the complex application process. Grace applied, knowing her chances were slim. There were hundreds of applicants for every opening, most with more impressive credentials on paper. But she made it through the first round. Then the second. Each interview was grueling. They asked about her legal philosophy, her temperament, her ability to be impartial. They ran background checks that went back to elementary school. They interviewed her colleagues, her neighbors, her professors from a decade ago. Grace kept working at legal aid through all of it. She didn't tell anyone except her mother and Judge Okonkwo. What was the point? She probably wouldn't get it anyway, but she did get it. Round after round, she advanced. The final interview was with a panel of senior judges who asked her the hardest questions she'd ever faced. What would she do if the law required an outcome she found morally wrong? How would she handle the stress? How would she remain objective after years of advocacy? Grace answered honestly. She didn't try to sound impressive. She just told the truth. "I've spent my career fighting for people who have no voice," she said. "As a judge, I won't be fighting anymore. I'll be listening. To everyone, that's what the job requires, and that's what I'll do. But I won't forget what I've learned. I won't forget what it's like to be powerless in a system that doesn't see you." 2 months later, she got the call. She'd been selected. Subject to final approval from the Judiciary Committee, she would be the newest circuit court judge. And now, sitting in this parking lot, that approval had come through. Grace looked back at the courthouse. She thought about the judge who'd dismissed her like she was nothing. Judge Harrison, the nameplate had said. She'd seen him in the hallways over the years, watched him in court. He had a reputation for being harsh, impatient, but he'd been on the bench for 20 years. He was respected. Would he remember her from today? Probably not. She was just another case to him. Another nobody with another excuse. The clerk wouldn't remember her either, or those lawyers who'd whispered about her, and that was fine. Grace didn't want revenge. That wasn't what this was about. But she did want them to understand something. She wanted them to know that the woman they'd dismissed, the woman they'd treated as less than, was about to become their colleague, their equal, maybe even their superior in the courtroom. She wanted them to feel what she'd felt just for a moment. That shock of realization, that stomach-dropping understanding that they'd made a terrible assumption. Grace pulled out of the parking lot and headed to work. She was already 2 hours late, and her supervisor would have questions, but she couldn't tell anyone yet. Not until after the official announcement. At the legal aid office, her colleague Raymond looked up from his desk. "How'd it go?" "Paid the fine," Grace said simply. "That's garbage." "You were helping someone." "Yeah, well, that's how it goes sometimes." Grace sat at her desk and tried to focus on work. She had 3 cases that needed her attention. A family facing foreclosure. A veteran denied his benefits. A teenage girl fighting for emancipation from abusive parents. These were her people. This was her work. And in 2 weeks it would all change. She felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She'd miss this. Miss being in the trenches fighting the good fight. As a judge, she'd have more power, more influence. But she'd also have to be neutral. She couldn't be an advocate anymore. Judge Okonkwo had warned her about this. You'll grieve your old role, she'd said. Every judge does. But you'll also realize that you can do more good from the bench than you ever could as an attorney. You can set precedents. You can change how the system works. You can make sure that people like your clients get a fair hearing. Grace hoped that was true. She hoped she wouldn't lose herself in the black robes and the formal language and the authority. She hoped she'd remember days like today, when she stood in front of a judge who couldn't be bothered to see her as human. That evening, Grace sat with her mother at dinner. They ate quietly, the way they always did. Her mother's hands shook as she lifted her fork. Some days were better than others. Today wasn't a great day. How was court? Her mother asked. They made me pay the fine. Her mother shook her head. That's not right. You were doing a good thing. I know, Mom. Did you tell them? About the appointment? Grace smiled. No, that's not how this works. When will you tell them? At the ceremony. When they have no choice but to know. Her mother's eyes sparkled with something Grace rarely saw these days. Mischief. I wish I could see their faces. You will, Mom. You'll be there. Front row. That night, Grace lay in bed and thought about the ceremony. She imagined walking into that courthouse not through the public entrance but through the judge's private hallway. She imagined putting on the black robes for the first time. She imagined standing before the audience taking her oath. She imagined seeing their faces when they realized who she was. But mostly, she imagined all the people who would come before her in the years ahead. The scared ones, the angry ones, the desperate ones. People who looked like her, who came from where she came from. People who needed someone on that bench who understood. That's what mattered. Not the shock value of her appointment. Not the satisfaction of proving people wrong. What mattered was that she'd be there. Really there. Listening. Seeing. Understanding. Grace closed her eyes and smiled in the darkness. 2 more weeks. Just 2 more weeks and everything would change. The morning of the ceremony, Grace woke up before dawn. She couldn't sleep anyway. Her mother was already awake too, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Big day, her mother said softly. Yeah. Grace poured herself coffee. Her hands were steady, but her stomach was doing flips. They'd kept the ceremony small and private, or so Grace had requested. But the Chief Justice's office had other ideas. It's a public event, they'd told her. The community has a right to attend. Plus, we need the local bar association there, the courthouse staff, other judges. It's tradition. So here she was, about to be sworn in front of everyone, including the people who'd treated her like dirt 2 weeks ago. Grace dressed carefully. She'd bought a new suit for the occasion. Nothing fancy but professional, navy blue, well-fitted. Her mother had insisted on coming shopping with her despite the difficulty walking. I want to see you pick it out, she'd said. My daughter, the judge. They arrived at the courthouse an hour early. Grace used the judge's entrance for the first time. It felt strange, surreal. A security guard she'd never seen before checked her name against a list and waved her through. Congratulations, Judge Lin. Judge. The word still didn't feel real. Judge Okonkwo met her in the hallway. She pulled Grace into a hug. How are you feeling? Terrified. Good. That means you're taking this seriously. Judge Okonkwo smiled. Come on, let me show you your chambers. They walked down the hallway together. Grace passed other judges' offices, their nameplates gleaming. And then they stopped at a door near the end. A fresh nameplate was already mounted. Judge Grace Lin. Grace touched the letters with her fingertips. This was really happening. Inside, the office was modest but dignified. A desk, bookshelves that would need filling, a window that looked out over the city. Grace could see the street below, people going about their morning. They had no idea that their lives might one day intersect with hers in a courtroom. The ceremony starts at 10, Judge Okonkwo said. We'll wait in here until... Oh, they call for you. Your mother's been seated in the front row. Raymond and the team from Legal Aid are here too. Grace felt a lump in her throat. They all came? Of course they came. You think they'd miss this? At 9:45, they could hear the ceremony room filling up. Voices echoed in the hallway. Grace peeked out and saw lawyers in suits, courthouse staff, local officials. The room was packed. She saw Judge Harrison arrive, looking as stern as ever. He took a seat in the second row, checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. The clerk from the window, whose name Grace had learned was Bethany, stood near the back, chatting with other administrative staff. And there, near the middle, was the young lawyer who'd whispered about her. He was laughing with a colleague, clearly treating this as just another networking opportunity. None of them knew. They came because attendance at judicial swearing-ins was expected if you worked in or around the courthouse. It was politics, courtesy, tradition, but they had no idea who they were about to see. At 10 o'clock exactly, the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Chief Justice Williams." Everyone stood. The Chief Justice entered, his black robes flowing. He was an imposing man, tall and dignified with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd interviewed Grace twice during the selection process and had been impressed by her record. "Please be seated," he said once he reached the podium. "We are gathered here today for a very special occasion. The swearing in of a new circuit court judge is always a momentous event. It represents not just a personal achievement but a commitment to justice, to service, to the law itself." Grace stood in the hallway, listening. Her heart pounded. "Today's appointee is someone I've come to respect greatly during the selection process," the Chief Justice continued. "Someone whose journey to this bench has been anything but traditional, and all the more impressive because of it." In the audience, people shifted in their seats. Grace could hear them wondering who it was. The appointment had been kept relatively quiet, announced only in legal publications that most people didn't read carefully. This judge graduated summa cum laude from State University Law School while working full-time and caring for an ailing parent. This judge spent the next decade representing the most vulnerable members of our community through legal aid work. This judge has tried over 200 cases argued before our state Supreme Court and earned the respect of colleagues across the legal spectrum. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. Grace could see his expression through the doorway. He was paying attention now. This judge has shown not just legal brilliance, but something equally important: character, compassion, the ability to see beyond case files to the human beings whose lives hang in the balance in our courtrooms. The Chief Justice paused. "It is my great honor to introduce our newest circuit court judge. Please welcome Judge Grace Lynn." The room fell absolutely silent. Grace stepped into the doorway. She could see their faces clearly now. Judge Harrison's eyes widened. His mouth actually fell open. Bethany, the clerk, dropped her phone. Grace heard it clatter on the floor. The young lawyer who'd mocked her went pale. Completely pale. He looked like he might throw up, but Grace didn't look at them. Not really. She looked at her mother, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. She looked at Raymond and her colleagues from legal aid, who were on their feet applauding. She looked at Judge Okonkwo, who was smiling like a proud parent. Grace walked to the front of the room with her head high. Her steps were steady. She wasn't the frightened woman who'd stood in that courtroom 2 weeks ago. She was exactly who she'd always been, but now everyone could see it. The Chief Justice smiled at her warmly. "Are you ready, Judge Lynn?" "I am, Your Honor." "Please place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand." Grace did as instructed. The Bible was old, worn from countless ceremonies before hers. Her mother had brought a family Bible too, just in case, and it sat on a table nearby. "Do you solemnly swear that you will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you as circuit court judge, according to the best of your abilities and understanding, agreeably to the Constitution and laws of this state?" Grace's voice was clear and strong. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I hereby declare you a duly appointed circuit court judge." "Congratulations, Judge Lynn." The room erupted in applause. Grace felt it wash over her. All that energy, all that validation. But more than that, she felt the weight of what she'd just sworn to do: to administer justice fairly, to see every person as equal, to discharge her duties faithfully. She thought about that parking ticket, about standing in front of Judge Harrison being dismissed and belittled. She thought about all the clients she'd represented over the years who'd been treated the same way. People who were never quite good enough, never quite worthy of real attention or respect. That ended now. At least in her courtroom, the Chief Justice gestured for quiet. Judge Lynn has prepared a few remarks. Grace stepped up to the microphone. She'd written a speech, revised it a dozen times, but now she set her notes aside. She needed to speak from the heart. Thank you, Chief Justice Williams, for that kind introduction. Thank you to Judge Okonkwo for mentoring me through this process. Thank you to my colleagues from Legal Aid for teaching me what justice really means. She paused. And thank you to my mother, who sacrificed everything so I could stand here today. Her mother sobbed quietly. Raymond handed her a tissue. I didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a judge, Grace continued. I grew up trying to survive, trying to help my family survive. Like many of you, I've known what it's like to struggle, to feel invisible, to stand in front of systems that seem designed to crush you rather than help you. She could see Judge Harrison shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Good. I've spent 10 years representing people who have no voice, people who are one paycheck from homelessness, people who don't speak English well enough to navigate our complex legal system, people who are judged by their appearance, their address, their bank account, rather than by the content of their character or the merits of their case. The room was absolutely silent now. As I take this bench, I make you a promise. Every person who enters my courtroom will be treated with dignity. Every person will be heard. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, connected or isolated, educated or not. In my courtroom, you are a human being deserving of respect. Grace looked directly at Judge Harrison now. He couldn't meet her eyes. Because justice isn't just about applying the law correctly. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. Understanding that behind every case number is a life, a story, circumstances we might not know. She glanced at the young lawyer. He was staring at his shoes. I know I have much to learn. I know there will be mistakes and difficult days ahead. But I promise to show up every single day committed to fairness, to compassion, and to the belief that our legal system can and should serve everyone equally. Grace stepped back from the microphone. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor I don't take lightly. The applause was louder this time. People stood. As Grace shook hands with the Chief Justice and the other judges on the platform, she could see the audience beginning to file out. Most came up to congratulate her. Raymond hugged her so tight he lifted her off the ground. Her legal aid colleagues surrounded her, laughing and crying. But Grace noticed 3 people who slipped out quickly without approaching. Judge Harrison, who left through a side door, Bethany the clerk, who practically ran out, and the young lawyer, who kept his head down and disappeared into the crowd. Judge Okonkwo appeared at her elbow. They know now. Yeah, Grace said quietly. They know. How does it feel? Grace thought about it. She didn't feel triumphant exactly, or vindictive. She felt something else. Something like hope. It feels like the beginning, she said. Grace's first day on the bench arrived with the weight of 1,000 expectations. She woke at 5 a.m, unable to sleep. The black robe hung on her closet door, pressed and ready. She'd tried it on 3 times the night before, standing in front of the mirror, trying to see herself as a judge. It still felt like playing dress-up. Her mother made her breakfast, eggs and toast, even though her hands shook badly that morning. Eat, she insisted. You need your strength. Grace arrived at the courthouse at 7:30, even though her first hearing wasn't until 9. She needed time to settle in, to prepare. The judge's parking space with her name on it still startled her. The private entrance still felt wrong, like she was sneaking in somewhere she didn't belong. But she did belong. She had to keep reminding herself of that. In her chambers, Grace reviewed her docket for the day. 12 cases, a mix of civil and criminal matters, nothing too complex for a first day. The Chief Justice had been kind about that. We'll ease you in, he'd said. At 8:45, there was a knock on her door. Her bailiff, a man named Thomas who'd been at the courthouse for 20 years, poked his head in. Judge Lynn? The courtroom is filling up. Lots of people curious about the new judge. Curious or concerned? Grace asked. Thomas smiled. Bit of both, probably. That's normal. You ready? No. Yes. Grace put on her robe and followed Toma. It's down the hallway. Other judges were heading to their own courtrooms. A few nodded at her. Judge Okonkwo gave her an encouraging smile. Judge Harrison walked past without making eye contact. The courtroom was indeed packed. Grace saw familiar faces from legal aid, colleagues who'd come to watch her first day. But she also saw courthouse regulars, lawyers who worked the circuit, and people in the gallery who had their own cases to hear. All rise for the Honorable Judge Grace Lynn. Everyone stood. Grace walked to the bench, her heart hammering. She'd been in this courtroom 100 times as an attorney. But from up here, everything looked different. She could see everyone, every face, every expression. She sat down. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. A chorus of "Good morning, Your Honor" came back to her. Grace took a breath. Before we begin, I want to say something. I know many of you are curious about how I'll run my courtroom. Here's what you can expect: fairness, respect, and patience. I will listen to every person who appears before me. I will consider every argument carefully, but I will not tolerate disrespect to anyone in this courtroom, whether that's directed at me, at opposing counsel, or at the parties involved. We're all here because the law matters, and we're going to treat each other accordingly. She could see people nodding. Good. Now let's get started. Bailiff, please call the first case. The morning went smoothly. A contract dispute between two small businesses. Grace listened to both sides, asked clarifying questions, and issued a ruling based on precedent. Nothing controversial. The second case was a landlord-tenant matter. The third was a traffic violation. Grace moved through them steadily, making sure she understood each situation before ruling. And then, right before lunch, Thomas called a case that made her stomach drop. State versus Rodriguez, unlawful assembly. The defendant was a young man, maybe 22, who'd been arrested at a protest. His attorney was the same young lawyer who'd mocked Grace in the hallway 2 weeks ago. The one who'd whispered that these people never take responsibility. The lawyer stood up, clearly nervous. His hands shook as he shuffled his papers. Good morning, Your Honor. Thomas Chen appearing for the defendant. Grace kept her face neutral. Good morning, Mr. Chen. I see this is a preliminary hearing on a misdemeanor charge. Is the state ready to proceed? The prosecutor, an experienced woman named Janet, stood up. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Chen, is your client ready? Yes, Your Honor. Thomas Chen's voice cracked slightly. Grace proceeded with the hearing. The facts were straightforward. Rodriguez had been at a peaceful protest that turned chaotic when a small group started vandalizing property. He was arrested along with dozens of others, though there was no evidence he'd personally damaged anything. Thomas Chen argued for dismissal. His argument was sloppy, disorganized. He kept losing his train of thought. Grace could tell he was intimidated and it was affecting his performance, but his argument had merit. The prosecution couldn't prove Rodriguez had done anything wrong beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence was circumstantial at best. Grace could have torn the young lawyer apart. She could have questioned his preparation, his logic, his professionalism. She could have made him feel exactly how she'd felt standing in that hallway while he mocked her. But what good would that do? It wouldn't help Rodriguez. It wouldn't serve justice. It would just be revenge, and revenge had no place on the bench, Mr. Chen. Grace said carefully. I understand your argument, but you're not presenting it clearly. Let me ask you directly. Are you arguing that the state lacks sufficient evidence to prove your client's participation in the criminal activity? Thomas Chen blinked. Yes, Your Honor, that's exactly what I'm arguing. Then say that. Don't bury your strongest argument under weaker ones. The court appreciates clear, direct reasoning. She turned to the prosecutor. Ms. Rodriguez, does the state have any evidence placing the defendant at the scene of the actual vandalism? Janet hesitated. We have evidence he was at the protest, Your Honor. That's not what I asked. Do you have evidence he participated in the vandalism? No, Your Honor, not direct evidence. Grace nodded. Then I'm inclined to agree with the defense. Being present at a protest is not a crime. The state needs to prove actual participation in criminal activity, not mere presence. I'm dismissing the charges. Mr. Rodriguez, you're free to go. The young man's face flooded with relief. He shook his lawyer's hand vigorously. Thomas Chen looked stunned. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Chen, please remain after we adjourn. I'd like a word in chambers. The color drained from his face. He nodded mutely. Grace finished the rest of her morning docket and called a lunch recess. As people filed out, Thomas Chen approached the bench hesitantly. In my chambers, please, Grace said. He followed her like a man walking to his execution. In her office, Grace gestured to a chair. Sit down, Mr. Chen, he sat. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Grace took off her robe and sat across from him, not behind her desk. She wanted this to feel like a conversation, not an interrogation. "Do you remember me?" she asked. Thomas Chen looked confused. "Your Honor, 2 weeks ago, I was in courtroom 312 contesting a parking ticket. You were in the gallery with a colleague. You made a comment about how these people never take responsibility." The blood drained from his face completely now. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Your Honor, I didn't. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were. Would it have mattered if you did?" He couldn't answer that. Grace leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, I didn't call you in here to humiliate you. I called you in here because I want you to learn something that's going to make you a better attorney." He looked up at her, uncertain. "Every person who walks into a courtroom is fighting a battle you know nothing about," Grace said. "Every person. The woman contesting a parking ticket might be a legal aid attorney caring for a sick parent. The young man at a protest might be a college student with a full scholarship who can't afford a criminal record. You cannot judge people based on how they look, where they come from, or your assumptions about who they are." Thomas Chen's eyes were wet. "I understand, Your Honor. Do you? Because in that courtroom today you almost failed your client. Not because you're not smart, you are. Not because you didn't understand the law, you do. But because you were so nervous about who was judging you that you forgot to do your job." She paused. "How do you think your client felt? He's facing charges that could ruin his future. He's depending on you, and you're too worried about impressing the judge to focus on him." "You're right," Thomas Chen said quietly. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself. You're better than what you showed me today. You got the right result, but not because of your advocacy. You got it because the law was clearly on your side, and I could see that. What happens when the law isn't so clear? What happens when your client needs you to fight harder?" Thomas Chen nodded. He looked miserable. Grace's voice softened. "I'm telling you this because someone told me something similar once. When I was a young attorney, I messed up a hearing. Badly. The judge called me into chambers afterward. I thought I was going to be reported to the bar. Instead, she taught me how to be better." "Judge Okonkwo?" Thomas Chen asked. "You know her?" "Everyone knows her." "She's a legend," Grace smiled. "She is, and she told me something I've never forgotten. She said that being a good attorney isn't about winning. It's about serving your client with integrity, competence, and respect for everyone involved. That includes the person sitting across the aisle, the judge on the bench, and the people in the gallery who you think aren't paying attention." She stood up. "I see potential in you, Mr. Chen, but you need to do better. Not for me. For your clients. They deserve your best, not your nervous best." Thomas Chen stood too. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't forget this." "I hope not. And Mr. Chen, the next time you're in a courthouse, in a hallway, anywhere, remember that you don't know who's listening. You don't know whose life you're affecting with your words. Words matter. Assumptions matter. They can hurt people in ways you never intended." He nodded, shame and understanding mixing on his face. After he left, Grace sat at her desk and put her head in her hands. That had been exhausting. But it had also been necessary. She could have destroyed him. Could have filed a complaint. Could have humiliated him publicly. But what would that have accomplished? It wouldn't undo what he'd said. It wouldn't change the past. But maybe, just maybe, it would change the future. Maybe Thomas Chen would remember this conversation the next time he was tempted to judge someone. Maybe he'd think twice. Maybe he'd be better. That evening, Judge Okonkwo stopped by Grace's chambers. "I heard about your session with young Mr. Chen. News travels fast. Always does in a courthouse. You handled it well. Firm but fair. I didn't want to be vindictive. You weren't. You were educational. That's exactly what he needed." Judge Okonkwo smiled. "How do you feel after your first day?" Grace thought about it. "Tired, but good. Like maybe I can actually do this. You can more than do it. You're going to be excellent at it." Judge Okonkwo squeezed her shoulder. "Just remember to be patient with yourself. You're going to make mistakes. We all do. The important thing is learning from them." That night, Grace told her mother about her day. About Thomas Chen, about the cases, about how strange it felt to sit on the bench. "You were merciful," her mother said. "That young man learned something today because you chose mercy over revenge." "I didn't want revenge, I know. That's what makes you different. That's what makes you the right person for this job." Grace hoped her mother was right. She hoped that she could be the kind of judge people needed. The kind who saw people, really saw them, and gave them the fairness and dignity everyone deserved. It was going to be a long journey. But after today, Grace felt like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path.